Good afternoon, everyone. As you're all sort of filtering in, I just want to say hello and welcome. My name is Brady Plunger. I'm one of the associate curators of education at the Stanley, and I am kind of the tech director for today. So I'll be watching the chat and the Q&A. And in a few moments, when we do get started, I'm just going to sort of hide myself away, but I will be in the background to help facilitate, as I said, Q&A and chat, and if anyone's having any issues, you can shoot me a message through the chat, and I'll do my best to sort of help you out as we get set to roll on this beautiful November afternoon that feels almost a little more like September, which I'm not complaining about. All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Um, Once again, my name is Brady Plunger, and I am so happy to welcome you all to this Saturday's at the Stanley Frenemies, Jackson Pollock and Willem De Kooning. I know I am particularly excited to learn about the relationships between these two artists. Kim and I were talking just before the program about how much we enjoy these Frenemies programs because we really get a chance to talk about the relationships between different artists. And once again, a few housekeeping things. I will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A. So feel free to, if you have questions or points of things you need clarified, feel free to shoot those into the Q&A. And Kim and I will be, we'll be happy to answer those things as they come in. And this webinar is being recorded, so just sort of have that in mind as we head into the program. And once again, thank you all for being here. And I'm going to turn it over to Kim to get started with Frenemies, Jackson Pollock and Willem De Kooning.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. It's a beautiful day outside, so hopefully you can enjoy it a little bit as you're watching this. We're going to talk about the idea of frenemies and kind of what that is a little bit. I'd also like us to keep in mind what that means when we're kind of pitting two people against each other and trying to figure out who's the best. How does that relationship work? Who benefits from that relationship, and kind of what keeps it going? We're going to be focusing on Jackson Pollock and Willem De Kooning, two artists that are considered or kind of vying for the title of the greatest American painter in mid-20th century. Here we have both of these artists in their studios, Pollock in East Hampton and Long Island, and Willem De Kooning in New York City, and you can see just a little bit of their works around them. These are two artists who had a lot of parallels in their lives as they were growing up and as they were getting started. De Kooning was a little bit older, about 8 years older than Pollock, and he is an immigrant. He comes to from the Netherlands in 1926 to get started as an artist in New York. Pollock is born in Cody, Wyoming, and both of these artists grew up in poverty. They had a lot of struggles just to kind of get by with the basics when they were younger. Both of their families were affected by separation and divorce of their parents, and Pollock was raised mainly by his mother. She moved to California when he was still young. De Kooning went kind of back and forth between his parents a little bit when he was a child, and they both had kind of difficult relationships with their mothers. We see photographs of them both here around age 2 or 3, and you kind of get a sense that they're a little bit different, maybe. Their personalities certainly had divergent aspects. Pollock was known for being impulsive and moody and prone to outbursts. De Kooning was more reserved. He was known for being a little bit more thoughtful and a bit of a perfectionist in his work. We see both artists here, 1926, 1927, 28. De Kooning is on the left and Pollock is on the right. At this point, they're starting to make a name for themselves, starting to conceive of themselves as artists. De Kooning was living in Rotterdam and he left school at 12 to become an apprentice at a commercial industry working with commercial designs. His boss encouraged him to attend art school. And so he went to the Academy of Fine Arts and Applied Sciences in Rotterdam. And while he was there, it was a really strict, very intense practice that they encouraged students to have. So he would sit in front of a still life for months at a time and continue to work on the same painting, the same drawing of it. So he would have to sit down in the same seat, in the same position, the same distance from the still life, the same kind of orientation to his paper, and just work. This was meticulous and intense and a really hard way to work. Pollock was the complete opposite. He attended art school, an art high school in Los Angeles, but he was kicked out twice. He was not known for his drawing skills at all. And in fact, he wrote to his older brother, Charles. Jackson Pollock was the youngest of 5 sons. And his older brother, Charles, was in New York studying to be an artist, was working with Thomas Hart Benton. And Jackson wrote to Charles to say, "My drawing, I will tell you frankly, is rotten. It seems to lack freedom and rhythm. It is cold and lifeless. It isn't worth the postage to send it. The truth of it is, I have never really gotten down to real work and finish a piece. I usually get disgusted with it and lose interest. Although I feel I will make an artist of some kind, I have never proven to myself nor anybody else that I have it in me." And his other older brother, Sandy, who was also studying art, said, "If you were to have seen Jackson's work, you would have thought that he should play tennis or be a plumber. Art was not in his cards if you would have just looked at what he was making." And he wasn't really putting in the time to really seem to get better. He wasn't sticking with something. So very different approaches and temperaments between De Kooning and Pollock. When this photo was taken of De Kooning in 1926, he had just arrived in the United States. And he got here by stowing away on a ship. So he had an opportunity to board the ship. He didn't even say goodbye to his siblings. He just got his stuff stowed away and came to the US. He was 22 years old. He had nothing with him. Pollock came to New York in 1930 with his brother. His brother Charles, who had been there, brought him over. And at that point, he met Thomas Hart Benton and started studying at the Art Students League. And he begins to start to find a voice. Thomas Hart Benton kind of takes him under his wing and they become very close, where Pollock is babysitting for his kids, spending a lot of time at Benton's house, having dinners. And so he's getting that kind of encouragement that he really needed as an artist to begin to create and feel like he is worthy of being an artist, that he has it in him to do that, and that he can actually produce the work that he has in his mind that he can make. Both of these men meet John Graham, who is another immigrant. He is of Polish noble ancestry, not very high noble, but he still fought for the Tsar in the Bolshevik Revolution. He was imprisoned and either escaped or was released. It's kind of fuzzy what exactly happened. He liked to say that he escaped. And he went to Paris and then the US. And he went back and forth between the US and Paris. He had exhibitions, he met artists in Paris, he knew Mondrian, and he would come to the US and hang out with the young artists there. He met De Kooning in 1928 and noticed the kind of strength that De Kooning had in his art. When De Kooning came to the US, he was working as a commercial sign painter and continuing to draw in the evenings and on the weekends when he wasn't doing the sign painting. And he was slowly moving into more modern art styles, more abstraction. So John Graham had met De Kooning and noticed this talent in him and the possibility that he could be a really great American painter. About 10 years later, John Graham meets Jackson Pollock, and he has the same reaction to him. So Graham is putting together an exhibition at Macmillan Inc. in New York City, and he is putting together a collection of works by young American painters, and they included De Kooning, Pollock, and Lee Krasner. And Lee Krasner has a studio around the block from Jackson Pollock. So she goes there, she meets him. They actually met a few years earlier at a party, but neither one really remembered it. And then they go together to De Kooning's studio. And when Pollock and De Kooning meet, they're kind of unimpressed by each other. But it's one of those things where, are they really that unimpressed, or are they putting on a front? Pollock was putting on the air of a cowboy. He was starting to embrace that Western persona of masculinity and toughness. And De Kooning, when he was younger and in Rotterdam, he had admired cowboys. He had posters from movies and pictures from magazines of the American West. And that was something that was really appealing to him. And here was Pollock coming to visit his studio, meeting him for the first time, really embodying those qualities. So in 1941, the end of 1941, Graham is putting together this show, and we have this meeting of all of these artists that are going to become really important in American art in the mid-20th century. And we have these artists coming together and meeting in other ways. So we have a photo here of Elaine De Kooning and Willem on the left, and Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner on the right. So both Pollock and De Kooning married other artists. Lee Krasner and Elaine De Kooning are powerful artists in their own right. And these were also women who worked tirelessly promoting their husbands' work and were really instrumental in their husbands getting attention and gallery shows, especially early on in their careers. After the Macmillan show opened in January 1942, Pollock starts to really find how he's going to be making paintings, how he's going to make a name for himself. And by the end of 1942, he's made a stenographic figure, which we see here. And this comes to the attention of Peggy Guggenheim. So Peggy Guggenheim is a New York socialite. Her father had died in the Titanic when it sank. And so she had a modest inheritance from that she used to buy art and open a gallery. She had been living in Europe and came back to New York in July 1941, and she opened the Art of the Century Gallery. At the end of 1942, she's putting together an exhibition with American and European artists, and she has kind of her own jury that she's assembled with artists that she admires. It's informal, it's not, an assigned jury, but these are people that she trusts. And it includes Piet Mondrian, an artist that Willem De Kooning kind of became aware of in the 1920s when he was still in Rotterdam and really admired. This is one of the works that was up for this exhibition that Guggenheim was putting on in the Art of the Century Gallery. And she saw it and had an incredibly strong reaction to it. And it was probably kind of on the nose with what Jackson Pollock was going to produce and his personality. So she saw this painting and she walks up and, talking to the other artists that were gathered there, she says, "This young man has serious problems and painting is one of them." She did not want to include this in the exhibition. She didn't get it. She was like, no way, this is not for us. Let's keep going. And Pete Mondrian stopped her and said, I'm trying to understand what's happening here. I think this is the most interesting work that I've seen so far in America. You must watch this man. And so Guggenheim agreed to include this in her show. And that, of course, began this long relationship that she has with Pollock. Now, in this painting, what is so unusual is this combination of the kind of Picasso-esque figures that he's using with these kind of exaggerated, almost kind of sculptural bodies, and the scrawling that he's doing all over this. So at this time, Pollock is into Jungian psychology. He's thinking about archetypes and thinking about kind of how signs and symbols convey meanings and what is eternal and lasting. This is sort of his break away from the more naturalistic painting of Thomas Hart Benton, who he had studied with, who he had worked a little bit on some of his murals with. And he's moving on to his more completely abstract style. Guggenheim and Pollock form a really significant relationship in Pollock's life. Guggenheim gives him 2 solo exhibitions in her Art of the Century gallery, which is monumental for an artist, especially at this time in the 1940s, where you have artists who are really struggling. New York is fairly cheap, and they're able to have their studio space and have really amazing light and space, but they're freezing. They're living off of coffee and cigarettes and what they can get at the diner. And it is a rough existence. And having a show at a gallery, especially a solo show that puts a number of your paintings forward, opens the opportunity for not only you to be seen, but for you to actually make some money. After Pollock showed in the Art of the Century gallery, Guggenheim commissioned him to paint mural. And of course, this is our painting, which is now at the Guggenheim Museum in New York on view. And this was commissioned for her entryway to her New York apartment. And there is so much mythology around this work. There are stories that Pollock procrastinated and was just really obsessing and worrying about how he was going to paint it, what he was going to paint, and didn't paint anything until the night before it was due. And so this is like a frenzied moment of creation where he makes this. We were able to have this conserved a few years ago by the Getty, and their scientific analysis revealed that it was in fact not made in one night, that it was made over time, that stories of Duchamp saying that an end should be chopped off to make it fit were untrue. But there's so much mythology around this because it is such a significant work for Pollock. It is moving farther into abstraction, and yet he's not completely leaving aside representation. So if we look at these, we have this kind of westward motion where it's like people are walking or moving across the canvas. There are these bodies that are kind of surrounded by these lyrical swirls of color that are popping off. And as you're looking at this, the pinks and the reds really surge forward. And it creates this kind of energetic frenzy that's not complete chaos, but it is a lot happening, right? It is all consuming. And if you're thinking about this in terms of an entryway, you have to be really close to this when you're encountering it. You don't have space to kind of step back and take it in. You are in it. With this, there was a huge party that Guggenheim threw, and it was a whole night where Pollock peed in the fireplace. There's talk of him and Guggenheim hooking up at one point. There's lots of things happening that kind of go into this mythology of Jackson Pollock and also mythology of mural. While all of this is happening, De Kooning is still trying to find his voice as an artist. He is a painter, like his training, where it was very meticulous and careful and slow, thinking about spending months at making the same still life. In his studio, he would work and erase and revise and add and take away. And it was this sort of torturous process to get anything finished. Guggenheim had some interest in Kooning as well. She went to his studio for a visit and saw one of his partially finished works and thought, hey, you bring that back. I'll take that to my gallery now and I'll put it up. And he was like, it's not actually finished. I'm still working on it. And so she said, great, keep working on it. In 2 weeks, you can just deliver it yourself to my gallery. That'll be great. And De Kooning was even less finished with it at the end of 2 weeks. So he had gone back and taken even more away in this back and forth of his process. So you have these artists who are moving around each other. They're encountering each other through friends. They see each other sometimes. They aren't really close friends, but they're definitely acquaintances and they're aware of each other. And as Pollock is getting these shows with Peggy Guggenheim's Art of the Century Gallery, De Kooning is recognizing that he is becoming somebody to contend with. If De Kooning wants to make a name for himself, he is going to have to, in some way, navigate around and deal with, be in dialogue with what Pollock is creating, because he is becoming such a huge presence. While Pollock is getting praise and attention for his work, he's not really making sales. So Guggenheim is supporting him with basically a stipend. He is under contract, and he's the only American painter at this time that has, modern American painter that has this kind of almost patron relationship established. And that is allowing him to continue to work, to go to Springs, East Hampton with Lee Krasner to get a house, set up his studio, and not worry quite so much about the pressure to sell. And that was really helpful for him to be able to continue to get deeper into his process and find his style. De Kooning was not as lucky yet. He was still struggling. He had his first solo show at Charles Egan Gallery in 1948, a few years after Pollock had had his first show. And it was a really long time before he sold anything from that. And Elaine De Kooning said that it was that kind of just having the show be extended, and not selling anything for a very long time was becoming hopeless. It made things start to feel like they were just hopeless. And that becomes pretty daunting. In this work from 1945, we see, this is another work from the Stanley Museum. We can see him going further into abstraction, but he's still keeping these symbols. We have that swirling color. It's much harder to make out any objects or figures in this work, but he's still tied to kind of the symbols that he's playing with here. He's still kind of figuring out how to navigate between representation and complete abstraction. He ends up breaking through that by the end of the 40s when he figures out drip painting. Thus is when he is using unprimed canvas. He's putting them on the floor of his barn, which is unlit by electric lights. He has to work during the day when there's daylight left, and he's dripping paint onto the canvas. He's using paint sticks, he's walking around it, walking through it, and creating this complicated web of color, of movement, and motion and gesture as he's painting this. And this is where he is really taking off. This is completely different than anything that people had been making up to this point. And it gets him a lot of attention, not only from the art world, where people are starting to talk about his process and are excited about this, but even beyond. So you have Life magazine in 1949 asking, is he the greatest living painter in the United States? And they're really setting up this debate and trying to make it, there's this tension between the sort of elites who buy this kind of painting, who are interested in it, and what's considered everybody else. Like, is this really any good? Is this, what is even happening here? But this is significant. You have Life with a really big subscription base throughout the United States, and here is Pollock inside of it. Within this article, he talks about two of his favorite painters. One is Wassily Kandinsky, and the second one is Willem de Kooning. So even though de Kooning isn't having the commercial success that Pollock is having, he's still very much on Pollock's radar. And Pollock recognizes that he's on the precipice. De Kooning is about to kind of explode. And that's what happens in 1950. Excavation is an almost fully abstract work by Willem de Kooning. This wins a major prize by the Art Institute of Chicago. The Art Institute also purchases this work. And then Alfred Barr from the Museum of Modern Art in New York selects this, a work by Pollock, and works by 6 other American painters to represent the United States in the Venice Biennale. And this is really massive. This is almost life-saving for de Kooning, who was just totally broke. And so this was this major windfall, and important for him to kind of get that confidence that he was going to actually be able to make money with his art and not just kind of eke by. It also gets him major attention from galleries and from people outside the art world. He starts to kind of get on the radar. And in 1950, Pollock tells Grace Hartigan, who's another abstract painter in their circle, everyone is shit but de Kooning and me. And so he is already, both of these artists are singling out the other as the one to beat. They're kind of the pace car that they need to keep up with and surpass. In 1950, Pollock is also continuing to get attention for his drip paintings. This is a sheet of photographs by Hans Nemuth, who also did a film documentary about Pollock. And within that documentary, there is a famous shot where Pollock is painting and dripping his paint on glass, and Nemuth has his camera underneath this glass and it's filming the paint coming down. This is a really difficult process for Pollock to go through. The filming starts off on a good foot, but it really deteriorates. Pollock is all about projecting an image of authenticity and hates phonies. He is like Holden Caulfield, right? Phonies are the worst. And so within this process, by being filmed like this and having the whole, painting on glass is such an amazing visual image, but it felt wrong to Pollock. It felt really uncomfortable. It felt like it was just for show. And it wasn't really him painting. He didn't really paint for this documentary in the way that he would if nobody were filming him. So that last day of filming, Pollock goes off the rails. So he would have these bouts of intense binge drinking at different times. Periodically, he would go into these dark drinking moments. And he had been on a 3-year path where his drinking was pretty much under control. The last day of filming of the Nemuth documentary, he went off the rails and went really intense into a binge. And that is, personally and professionally, really difficult. It also becomes difficult for Pollock because de Kooning is moving on in a different way. He seems to have found his style in the early 50s. And it's happening at a time when Pollock, who has been making drip paintings for a few years now, is starting to feel stale. And he's getting criticism for that. So Clement Greenberg, who is a critic who comes to prominence, really makes his name writing about Pollock and brings Pollock to prominence as well through his writing. He's beginning to say that Pollock is washed up, that everybody kind of reaches the end, they, hit a wall, and Pollock's done that, and like that's about it for Pollock. As that's happening, Pollock is getting deeper into his alcoholism, and we have De Kooning, who works on the Woman series for 3 years and finally shows them at Sidney Janis Gallery in 1953. Here's one example from that, Woman 1. This is in the collection of the Museum of Modern Art. And you can see that he is thinking about what Pollock is doing with his drip paintings. We can see these drips coming down the canvas. And you can see them going in some other directions as well. They're not all dripping down. You have drips that are kind of going diagonal and off in other directions. So while Pollock is walking around his canvas on the floor, De Kooning is rotating his canvases and not just leaving them in the same position as when he starts them. We also see a significant difference between Pollock and De Kooning in that De Kooning is not abandoning representation completely. We can see identifiable features of a woman, right? They are grotesque, they seem violent or comical, but they are there, right? It's very clearly a human figure. We have eyes, nose, a mouth, breasts, arms, legs. All of these features come out in a very clear way. And so Pollock comes to this opening. Everybody was sort of the small group of abstract artists. They would come to the openings. They were really casual kind of parties that would happen. With Pollock, by the end of the 40s, it's becoming more business. You're getting more art collectors that are coming to these, and not just the ones that are already friends with these artists. People who are looking for investment pieces are coming. When Pollock walks into this gallery, he yells across the room, "Bill, you betrayed it. You're doing the figure. You're still doing the same goddamn thing. You never got out of being a figure painter." And so he's clearly drunk, right? And a little belligerent. And De Kooning yells, "Well, what are you doing, Jackson?" And that kind of has two edges to it. Pollock is stuck and everybody knows it. And so it's kind of a jab at him in that way. But it's also a little bit of a jab because Pollock is also at this point experimenting with going back into the figure. He's drawing and painting women and heads and people, and things are starting to pop out. It's not just pure abstraction. It's not non-objective painting. He is going back to representation as well. And so after this interaction, Pollock goes to a bar and just keeps drinking all night. He almost gets hit by a car coming out of the bar. And this is really Pollock's descent into drinking. And it ends up kind of destroying his relationship. His career is really struggling. And it's happening at the same time as De Kooning is getting more attention and becoming more well-known. So that also has to play into it a little bit, to see somebody that you had been vesting for so long now kind of shooting off, and you're just sinking. By the summer of 1956, Pollock is in bad shape. He and Krasner have had a number of yelling matches, some that have gotten physical, and Krasner leaves for the summer and goes to Europe. Ruth Klingman moves into their house, and Klingman is a young art student. She's an artist herself, and she and Pollock are dating, and they've been dating for about 2 months. And they decide to go out, they go drinking, and in the summer of 1956, on the way home with Ruth's friend Edith Metzger in the car, Pollock hits a tree. Pollock and Metzger die. Immediately, Ruth gets thrown from the car, and she's the only survivor. So in 1956, it's kind of decided that who's the greatest. Pollock is out, and De Kooning is the sole survivor of that. After Pollock's funeral, De Kooning, back at a friend's house for a gathering, says, "It's over, I'm number one." And that sounds really harsh and crass, but I don't think it was said necessarily in a gloating way, just kind of recognizing the end of this era, the disappearance of this person that had been a constant in your professional life and your personal life. They would encounter each other in bars, gatherings at friends' houses. Sometimes it was pretty antagonistic, to the point where Pollock, when he was drinking very heavily, he would go into Cedar Bar and really try to pick fights with anybody. He tried to pick one with De Kooning and got punched a few times. Another time in the Hamptons over the summer, when De Kooning and his wife Elaine were there painting. A lot of the artists went there over the summer to paint, and Pollock went over to De Kooning's house when he was out, and his wife was there. Elaine called Willem and some of their other friends to come back, and when they arrived, De Kooning and Pollock were kind of horsing around. They got into a scuffle, and then De Kooning fell on Pollock and broke his ankle, which then further debilitated Pollock. He had to rely even more on Lee Krasner, and his drinking kind of got worse. And then he re-broke his ankle a little bit later. So there are lots of things that were happening, lots of circumstances where the two men were thrown together, and they were certainly thrown together in the media in the way that the art scene was being written about. This is a work, De Kooning goes on, and he lives until 1997. And so his career continues for decades after Pollock's. This is another work that we have of his in our collection, Revenge. It's from Etchings and Poems by Harold Rosenberg, who is another art critic. He coined action painting and focused on kind of this gesture and the performance of creating a painting, particularly Pollock kind of walking around it, and the importance of the body moving in order to create it. And so we see some features that we see in De Kooning's painting also coming through in this print, the kind of gestures, the sort of violent brushstrokes that we see going through his paintings, particularly of women. And so this is an etching where we see these kind of intense lines being etched into the plate. So who is the greatest? It's a question that seems in some ways kind of silly to talk about when we're talking about art, something that's so subjective and can be so personal. These questions about the greatest, I think what they're driven by is not so much the artists themselves, but the people from the outside who are viewing them and want to even further stoke feelings of competition and rivalry that might already exist between the two. But thank you everybody for coming this afternoon. And if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. Please put those in the Q&A and the chat if you haven't done that yet.
Hey, Kim. I wanted to start with a question, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead.
I wonder, what's so interesting is there's many great kind of rivalry, frenemy type pairings that we can find throughout art history. But I wonder from a curatorial perspective, from a museum professional perspective, when you're looking into something like Pollock and De Kooning, what's different about researching folks in the 20th century versus when you're thinking further back? Like I'm thinking maybe like to go as far back as maybe like Titian and Veronese or even further.
Mhm.
Because I think there's some things here that are really, as a researcher, are very exciting that we don't always find when we're looking back further.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I think it will be very different researching these artists in 100 years than it is right now. But I think for the 20th century, we're fortunate that we have so many materials digitized. So it's not essential that the original documents, the original newspapers or journals remain. It's always very helpful when those physical objects are still there. But we have the advantage of being able to access those things from a distance, especially now during COVID. That's something that we're all really recognizing, what we're able to access through the internet. But it's really changed the way that we can research. The Archives of American Art have so much that's available online. There's also, when you're closer to the artist, you have all of their networks, even beyond the art world, that become more available, that kind of open themselves up. People who maybe won't be remembered in 100 years because they aren't as famous, or their work wasn't saved in the same way that like maybe Elaine de Kooning's or Lee Krasner's writings were. Those things are still kind of available. And we're still close enough that you have all of the kind of salacious details that are kind of still swimming around and seem, really near. De Kooning died in 1997, which isn't that long ago. And so, he was able to continue to produce art and write about Pollock and talk about Pollock still like fairly recently. And so there are things, and also I think something that is really significant that we wouldn't have had in maybe like the 16th century is the amount of information from women that we have preserved. We have Ruth Klingman has her own memoir, and it focuses on Pollock. It's called Love Affair, I believe. And she and Pollock were only together for 2 months. And so this is something that she probably wouldn't have been able to write or get published, even a couple of 100 years ago. Another kind of weird fact and overlap between Pollock and De Kooning is that less than a year after Pollock died, De Kooning started dating Ruth Klingman, and they dated for a few years. And De Kooning really doesn't make it into her memoirs and her stories. It's Pollock is the great love. But that weird, both Pollock and De Kooning had a lot of extramarital relationships, and Elaine de Kooning as well had relationships. But that is one really weird piece of the puzzle that we probably wouldn't have as much information about if we were looking at it at a different point. De Kooning also buys a house and moves across the street from the cemetery where Pollock was buried. And moved there in the 60s and stayed there for the rest of his life. So do that. I don't know what that means, but an interesting decision.
Wow, I did not know about the house. That is some next level. And that is not, I am not going to interpret that I am not a De Kooning specialist, so I'm just going to leave that lie. But that's really, really interesting to think about, especially thinking about the records of women, because I think when we do look back further, the records of wives and partners of male artists become harder and harder to come by. So I thank you for highlighting that. And a sort of a maybe a future question: are there any other frenemy pairs that you're watching in our collection that you think could be a program in the future?
I don't know. I would be interested So the frenemies that I have really seen and been thinking about tend to be male, and Krasner and Elaine de Kooning definitely had contentious moments, but it seems like those were really tied to their husbands. So I'm interested in finding similar kind of relationships between women, and wondering what those relationships are and kind of how those get pitted against each other. I think there's a lot of outside pressure on women to be in competition with each other, but I don't think it necessarily always manifests that way. I think it's probably a more nuanced relationship. And I think once we get into any of these, the Pollock and De Kooning, last year I looked at Matisse and Picasso in a Frenemies Satyrs of the Stanley, and that was, also, it's not just, the competition. There is a lot of respect that goes into that. But I'd be interested in exploring this more with the women in our collection.
Fantastic. And I'd love to open it up to the crowd. If anyone has any questions that they're thinking about, you could drop those in the Q&A or the chat, because we are coming up to time, but we do have a few minutes if there's any burning questions out there in TV land, I'll call it. Or is everyone just itching to get outside and enjoy this beautiful day? I'm sitting at my window looking out and just thinking about, like, I'm ready to dive right outside myself. I'm not seeing anything. So I suppose, Kim, are there any bulletins that we should be sharing with folks right before they head out?
Something to keep in mind is if you are a member of Stanley Reads, we are deciding our new book and meeting time for the spring. So I'll be sending those out again, that survey this week. And if you want to be part of Stanley Reads, you can still register. It's free. The link is on our website, and then you can help vote for the spring book. We're looking at contemporary Indian authors, and we're selecting from short stories, fiction, a recent Iowa Writers Workshop graduate is included in the fiction group, and some nonfiction books.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again to everyone for joining us today. We're always so glad to see folks, zooming in to join us for these Saturday afternoon talks. And, we wish everyone enjoy this beautiful weather, because we know in Iowa it's a finite timeline in terms of weather like this. So enjoy things, stay healthy, stay safe, take good care. And especially as we head closer and closer to the holiday season. So thank you all again so much for joining us, and have a wonderful rest of your weekend.